Let's begin this morning with a Dilbert comic strip that I think very well illustrates the parable we're going to look at. Dilbert, Alice, and Wally are going through their annual performance review. The pointy-haired boss, as they call him, says, "Alice, your performance this year meets expectations. You get a 2% raise." She explodes, "Meets expectations? I worked 80 hours every week." He says, "Yeah, well, I expected that." Alice said, "I earned 3 patents this year. The company will make millions." The boss says, "Really? Well, I expected that too." She continues, "I donated bone marrow to our biggest customer twice." He says, "I noted that under attendance problem." In the last panel, Alice is in the lunchroom with her face in her hands. Dilbert says, "I told you that bone marrow thing would haunt you." And Wally says, "I'm starting to think that time I worked through lunch was for nothing." Maybe you've had a boss like that who refused to give you credit no matter how hard you worked, or maybe even worse, took credit themselves for the work that you had done. Or maybe your spouse is quick to criticize and never seems to praise. Or a parent that never seems pleased with anything that you do and nothing you do is right. Or a child that assumes that they need to be catered to without showing any gratitude whatsoever. Or a friend who expects you to help when they need you, but they're never there when you need them. You see, if we do a good job, we expect to be recognized, thanked, compensated in some way. If we perform better than our coworkers or competitors, like Alice, we expect that fact to be acknowledged and rewarded, like Alice. What we don't expect is to be told that our hard work is, well, expected. We continue our look at God's upside-down kingdom from the parables Jesus tells in the book of Luke. We come today to Luke 17 and the parable of the unworthy servant. I think Scott Adams must have read Luke 17 before he wrote that Dilbert comic strip. Here's the moral of the story from our parable. When you have done all that you were commanded, say, "We are unworthy servants. We have only done what was our duty." He seems to say that no matter what we do to serve God, it's just expected. Give to the poor, become a missionary, become a martyr, give bone marrow. God just expected that. Well, let's look at the parable, but start with its backstory. Our parable is a conclusion of a series of teachings that we remember from Matthew's version. First, Jesus warns us not to make choices that will become a stumbling block to others. Luke 17, verse 1. Jesus said to his disciples, "Things that cause people to stumble are bound to come, but woe to anyone through whom they come. It would be better for them to be thrown into the sea with a millstone tied around their neck than to cause one of these little ones to stumble. So watch yourselves." It's inevitable, he says, that such things will happen, but we'd better be very careful. Sin does not just impact the sinner. It causes others to be impacted for the worse as well. It's better to take a long walk off a short pier than to make a choice that causes someone else to fall into sin. We must take every precaution not to cause one of these little ones to stumble. Little ones here likely refers to disciples that are weaker and therefore more at risk than we are. We must understand that going my own way and doing my own thing harms not just me, but it harms all those whom I influence. Secondly, we must also be quick to forgive anyone who offends us. The second part of verse 3. If your brother or sister sins against you, rebuke them, and if they repent, forgive them. Even if they sin against you 7 times in a day, and 7 times come back to you saying, "I repent," you must forgive them. This is the short course version of what Jesus says in Matthew 18. If someone sins against you, don't talk about them, talk to them. Give them the chance to explain, to make things right, to repent. And if they do, Jesus says, you must forgive them. In fact, every translation I looked at uses the word must here, except for the King James that says thou shalt. Either way, this is a commandment. We must forgive. Even if they sin and repent 7 times on the same day, we must forgive them. With those 2 commands, Jesus sets the bar of discipleship pretty high. All you have to do is to never be offended and always forgive everyone. The apostles look up at that high bar and they know they need help. The apostles said to the Lord, "Increase our faith." Verse 5. I'm not sure Jesus' response in verse 6 sets their minds at ease all that much. Jesus replied, "If you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mulberry tree, 'Be uprooted and planted in the sea,' and it will obey you." The mustard seed was very small, and the mulberry tree had very deep roots. His point is that with faith, nothing God demands is ever impossible. You start small and believe and keep trusting in God, and He is always faithful. Obviously, Jesus doesn't mean that we literally should be able to uproot trees with our faith. That would come in handy when it was time to weed the flower beds. But He's already told us what it is that He's really talking about here. He's talking about living faithfully so that we never offend others. He's talking about having the kind of faith that allows us to forgive others who offend us. We don't need a great faith to do those things. We just need a little faith in a great God. But what if we have that kind of faith? What if we think we have that kind of faith? What if we are able to never offend anyone and always forgive everyone? Then we need the parable that Jesus tells at the conclusion. Let's watch the parable dramatized along with its context from the Lumo Project video series.
Jesus said to his disciples, "Things that cause people to stumble are bound to come, but woe to anyone through whom they come. It would be better for them to be thrown into the sea with a millstone tied round their neck than to cause one of these little ones to stumble. So watch yourselves. If your brother or sister sins against you, rebuke them, and if they repent, forgive them. Even if they sin against you 7 times in a day, and 7 times come back to you saying, 'I repent,' you must forgive them." The apostles said to the Lord, "Increase our faith." He replied, "If you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mulberry tree, 'Be uprooted and planted in the sea,' and it will obey you." Suppose one of you has a servant ploughing or looking after the sheep. Will he say to the servant when he comes in from the field, "Come along now and sit down to eat"? Won't he rather say, "Prepare my supper, get yourself ready, and wait on me while I eat and drink? After that, you may eat and drink"? Will he thank the servant because he did what he was told to do? So you also, when you have done everything you were told to do, should say, "We are unworthy servants. We have only done our duty."
The NIV uses the word servant here, but the word is doulos, or slave. This is not someone who is free to serve someone, but someone that has been sold into slavery. Translations generally use the word servant because in our experience, we think of slavery in terms of our American past. Slaves in the Roman Empire were taken as prisoners of war or maybe captured by slave traders, but very often they sold themselves into slavery because of abject poverty, or they were sold into slavery because of great debt. Most slave owners only had one slave in their household, and they used them in multiple ways. They were actually seen as part of the household, and Paul has several words for both slaves and slave owners who were Christians in the household sections of several of his epistles. In the parable, Jesus essentially tells us, when does a slave get paid overtime? Your slave works hard in the field all day, but what happens when they come in at night? Do you fix them a hearty supper to show gratitude and thankfulness for their hard work? That would be nice and even Christian, but that's not how slavery worked. After the field chores, the slave would come in and expecting to do the household chores. They would do the cooking. In other words, slaves were treated pretty much like we treat moms. Happy Mother's Day. The NET here uses, instead of the word unworthy, undeserving of special praise. Slaves were never deserving of special praise. For a slave, there was no work that was above and beyond the call of duty. So what is the point of this parable for us? It's our performance review. What happens when I have enough faith as a mustard seed and it starts to show in my life? I'm doing my duty. I never cause anyone to stumble, and I forgive everyone without grumbling. I never let my temper get away from me, and I settle matters quickly. I am faithful in all of my commitments, and I am committed to always tell the truth. I always turn the other cheek. I always go the second mile without grumbling or complaining. I love my neighbor as myself, and even love and pray for my enemies. In other words, I successfully and consistently live out the Sermon on the Mount. Actually, that was just Chapter 5 of the Sermon on the Mount. Chapters 6 and 7 don't get any easier. Jesus has a word for me in this alternative universe where I am a nearly perfect servant. He says, son, you're just doing your job, nothing above and beyond the call of duty. We are the slaves of God, and all that we do is simply what God is do. The best we can get on our job performance meets expectations. We'll never do too much. We'll never give too much. We'll never love too much. We'll never obey too much. We can't serve God above and beyond the call of duty. He deserves everything that we can give him. We once saw salvation as depending on our right response, the right rights. We had to obey the gospel by understanding and responding correctly. We had to take all the correct steps in the right order and understand each of them in the right way. We had to be part of the right church and worship in the right way. We had to have the right positions on all the right issues to really be right. We said we believed in grace, but grace was God's part in salvation. Yeah, he did the heavy lifting at the cross, and we saw that as 90% of what it took to be saved. Our response was only 10%, but we had to be 100% right on that. The parable speaks to that kind of works-based, grace-denying, legalistic idea. Even if we can do everything that God tells us to do perfectly, we are still unworthy servants. As Cole said in the prayer last week, Jesus is the only one to ever do all that God requires. But even if we could come close, even if we could be 99.9% perfect, we're only doing what's expected. We're only doing our duty. We are all unworthy servants, no matter how well we perform as servants. Today, many see grace, but they see it as, well, don't sweat the small stuff, and it's all small stuff. They see grace as permission not to take God too seriously. We are saved by grace. Nobody's perfect. We all sin, so why worry? Why sweat the small stuff? If we never get it right, then why stress over service? Because we are servants. Yes, we're unworthy servants, but we are servants nonetheless. We are servants, and that really gives us basically two choices. Paul in Romans 6, verse 15, what then? Shall we sin because we are not under law but under grace? By no means. Don't you know that when you offer yourselves to someone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one that you obey, whether you are slaves to sin, which leads to death, or to obedience, which leads to righteousness. Grace doesn't mean that we get to work less diligently or less demandingly or even less. Grace means we get to choose who it is that we serve. We get to choose who is our master. Our relationship with God to God doesn't depend on us getting everything exactly right, but our relationship to God is very clearly defined. We are his slaves. Listen to Paul as he describes how this grace and works thing works out when you're a slave. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 10, by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace to me was not without effect. No, I worked harder than all of them, yet not I, but the grace of God that was with me. Jesus says we are all unworthy servants who only do what's expected of us. We are imperfect, flawed, inadequate, unworthy servants. That's to be expected. Our best efforts at service are only filthy rags before God. That's expected. We are unworthy servants, but servants serve. That's just what we do. May we strive today and every day to be the best servant of Jesus Christ that we can be. We may be unworthy servants, but the God that we serve is worthy of our best efforts. May we be the kind of servants that he calls us to be.